God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, we call upon you now and ask for your direction and your inspiration to be people of freedom, people who will stand in the gap for others, to have the courage to speak truth to power. And God, truly, may we be transformed people for this ever-transforming world. In your blessed name we pray. Amen. Music is celebration. It provides entertainment, but it is also a mood shifter, a pain escaper, and an encouragement maker. We rely upon the lyrics and the music to transform us to a place where maybe we simply don't want to be because sometimes our hearts are heavy. But there is something about music that can truly transform us into a different person, into another place, to have a better perspective on how we see the world. Imagine if you were in the shoes of one of the protesters carrying one of the placards during the hot summer of 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. And you might have had the fear and the trepidation, wondering if a dog was going to come out of nowhere and take a chunk out of your leg. Or some protester on the other side would spit in your face. Or if the police would come and round all of you up and throw you into a hot wagon, only to go into a hot jail where there's barely air circulating. It's music that can give you the courage to keep on keeping on, and can transform you into someone who is cowardly afraid into a great champion who can stand in the face of all kinds of dangers, toils, and snares. This series in which we find ourselves in, How Can I Keep From Singing? It is a look at the lives of African Americans from the time that they arrived here on slave ships to our modern day, and looking at how music has been an integral part of the movement for equality and of freedom, and how people can rely upon that same type of power to do the most impossible task. Many people feel that slavery ended in the year 1865. But according to the author and lawyer Brian Stevenson, he writes, the idea of racial differences has been a problem that the U.S. has had ever since the Native Americans were slaughtered and their land was stolen. This was justified because the Native Americans were labeled as savages. When you label another group as other or inferior, less than, it's much easier to treat them as second-class citizens. And the U.S. became comfortable with 2.5 centuries of slavery because of a negative and damaging distinction that was developed around race. The idea that blacks are not as good as whites is the crux or the basis of white supremacy. Slavery did not end in 1965, it just simply evolved. Maybe African Americans weren't chained up on a plantation, but they were still beaten, drowned, whipped, lynched for many decades that followed. Oftentimes when you go to a lecture at a college or you come to a church and it's like, oh, there they go again. Talking about our history that we would soon forget. Why does this keep coming up? Can't we just simply get past this? Why can't we just all simply get along? Because of the words of Bryan Stevenson reminds us that the whole issue of racial difference still exists. And when we wonder about many of the issues and the problems that we face here today and why people simply can't get along, it's because the United States has never really dealt with its racist problems. And so thus it is good and it's wise for us, particularly as believers in Christ, to have discussion, to have conversation, to explore what is really going on. Because if we do not, we will continue to allow injustice to flourish and people to be erased or looked down upon. And it is very vital important for us as MCC Detroit, because we claim that we are striving to be an all-inclusive church. It is something that this area sorely needs. Because you can go and find a church where people of different races worship together. But then to have the added dimension, it's like, and we don't care about your sexual orientation or your gender identity. In fact, we're not going to erase it, but we're going to celebrate it.
That's right. Yes, say it.
Come on in.
That's right.
We want to be all-inclusive.
Yes.
And since that is our mission, since that is our goal, it is right and proper for us to talk about issues such as racial differences and even racial segregation still happening in the year 2020. When you think about the role of the Christian church, as I mentioned last week as we talked about the African American spirituals and how messages were communicated through those songs, we recognize that the enslaved, and we talked about last week that not calling them the slaves, but the enslaved and their descendants, as they heard biblical stories related to the plight of the Israelites. And so as they heard the story of God's interaction with that chosen nation, that they saw themselves in that. And that spoke about my freedom and my liberation. For I brought you up out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And thus, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly before your God? That they identified with the plight of the Israelites, and they also saw their redemption as the Israelites. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam were indeed sent to them as the enslaved through the likes of a Harriet Tubman, a Frederick Douglass, a Sojourner Truth, and a Booker T. Washington. They were those mood shifters, the pain escapers, the encouragement makers for those who lived during the time of Reconstruction after the Civil War and slavery supposedly came to an end. For those who were born into slavery, and all you knew was simply being a pack mule for your master. How then do you get a better and a more stronger self-esteem of yourself? That's where the Christian church comes back in. Because as you had segregated churches in the black church, it was through the preached word and the sung word where individuals had a transformative experience of who they were. And so when they heard scriptures such as, "You are the salt of the earth," it would have been preached, "You are the salt of the earth." And if salt has lost its taste, then how can the saltiness be restored? You are the light of the world.
Yes.
A city built on a hill cannot be hid. And they received their encouragement not only through the preached word, but the song word as well. Songs like "Go Tell It on the Mountain." And this song uses biblical analogies. And it talks about the story of Moses freeing the Jews from Egypt. And it was an instruction for Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, as he also led a people to a freedom. The preached word and the sung word. Protest and prose. How can someone survive the horrificness of slavery or of Jim Crow or even of mass incarceration today? You survive when you get hope. And that hope can come through the form of encouragement through the preached word and the sung word. But I would challenge us to say, how many sermons, how many preached words do we really know the words to if it didn't come from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King? But how many songs do we remember? And the messages of hope and of freedom and equality and of sisterhood and brotherhood. Songs that are still sung today. Songs that still apply to our current situation. That can transform us from our downtrodden state to look higher and brighter. To a place where God sees all of us as equal. Not to stay segregated, but we all have the same blood flowing through our veins. On the outside, we may look different, but on the inside, we each are God's creation. And because of that, I love you. I respect you. I see you as God created you to be. Not less than, but as my equal, as my sister, as my brother. And it's those songs from the civil rights era that transform people from a place of small-mindedness to courage. To say, I'm going to stand tall. I'm going to fight. That even though they may have said I was 2/3 of a human being once upon a time, I know my God that says I am fully created to be all that I am to become, a human being. The laws and the Constitution of the United States may try to strip me of my liberty, but I subscribe to a higher law and a higher word that gives me encouragement to keep on keeping on. Oh, freedom, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I be buried in my grave, but I'll go home to my Lord, and I'll be free. And in that message, to say that there's something more and much greater than this world in which we know, that it is worth it to put my very life on the line for my own freedom and the freedoms of my sisters and brothers, because even if they do strip me of my life, I'll go home and I'll be free. So I'm going to keep my eyes on that prize and continue to keep on keeping on. You might try to strip me and put me down, but see, I see myself through a different lens. The lens that my God has given me, and the lens that was given to my ancestors before me. And I'm going to pass it on to each other. It does me no good simply to have peace for us four and no more. If I'm truly am about peace, and I'm truly am about freedom, then that means I have to go out of my own comfort zone and start talking to people who are different from me, and to say, how is it that we all can be together in this? Because if anyone is held captive, all of us are held captive. If one is not free, none of us are free.
Amen. That's right.
And so it is our duty to go outside of ourselves, to have conversations we're not comfortable with having, and to move forward. Protest and prose. One of the mission of uplifting the race was infused by the work of musicians and writers like Langston Hughes. Many of you may have heard of this song, not this song, but of this poem. It says, I too sing America. He writes, I too sing of America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh. I eat well and I grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table. When company comes, nobody dare say to me, go eat in the kitchen. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am. Amen. And be ashamed. I too am America. It's poems, words, encouragement from songs and poetry during that era that gave people the strength to keep on keeping on, but also change their minds and change their vision of not only themselves, that I'm not less than, but you aren't either. Even though we may be of different races, and even though we may have different upbringings, we can't allow that to keep us separate.
That's right.
And we have to get to a place where we can continue to have dialogue with one another. And again, especially in this place, it is more vital for us as an inclusive church to have those types of conversations with one another. Imagine as new people come in, and it's like, I have not seen this before. What is going on up in here? Who are these people of different ages and races and backgrounds and expressions, all worshiping God together? I thought that was a domination. But we all listen to the same good news. And we all listen to the same encouragement. And we can all see the same vision of something that's new, something that is different, Something that maybe our parents didn't subscribe to. But we're in a different place, in a different time, and that vision, we're going to let it continue to spread. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast kept us far on the way, thou who has by thy might has led us into the light, new vision. Keep us forever in the path, we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land. Those are the words of Left Every Voice and Sing by James Weldon Johnson. And even as you listen to their words, and even if you're not African American, it's not for you to say, oh, well, that's for them. That's your national anthem. That's not my national anthem. When he wrote those words, there was an aspiration, and in fact, you didn't even hear it. There's an aspirational tone in those lyrics to say, this is not just for a small group of people. If it was, it would be cheap. This is an aspirational vision for all of us. When we say true to our God and true to our native land, we're talking about Africa. We're talking about a different land. A different land that all of us are citizens of. That once we close our eyes for the final time on this plane, we'll open our eyes to a new land, to our God. When we say we're going to be true to our God, what does that mean? As we heard in the scriptures earlier, that God expects for us, requires of us, to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. That is how we can be true to our God and true to our native land. That the words of the songs and of the poetry that came out of the civil rights era, they're not just for a certain class of individuals. That when you see those images, you say, oh, that's too much, and you turn it off. Those are your songs. Those are your people. Those are your sisters and brothers. And if we think that's just simply back then we also are small-minded, and we're not looking and we're not paying attention. That this is true all over our globe still today. So what are we going to do about it? What does God require of us here and now? How is it that we can just not simply say, well, that's past and history, but how can we learn from those places and from those people? Those who were the mood shifters and the pain escapers and the encouragement makers. How can that be true of us as well? How can we be transformed from our own world and our own small problem to say, I'm not alone. There are others who I need to connect with as well. And they may look different from me, but God has blessed me by sending them into my life.
Amen. Yes. Yes.
And I appreciate them.
Yes.
And I'm going to fight to protect them.
Yes. Yes.
What does God require of MCC Detroit? What does God require of the Christian church? When we get to a place where we say that God, what you're calling me to is something way bigger than what I can truly take on. But God, I know you're going to be with me. I know you're going to walk with me. I know you're going to guide my feet. And I won't be moved. And the times they are changing. And God, help me to be faithful to you. I'm calling upon you to give me that hope, to give me that freedom, to give me that unity for my sisters and my brothers.